Hello beautiful people and welcome to 3 levels of elemental reactions from new player to theory crafter. Today, I'll be going over a lot of mechanics that you may or may not already know. I'll be starting with the basics for someone who's relatively new to the game or hasn't looked into how the elemental reactions work. This includes going over elements, elemental resonance, elemental reactions, as well as going over the principles of aura and trigger. Then, we'll move on to more specific stuff, namely every reaction, how they work, their numbers, strengths, and weaknesses. Finally, we'll be going over the principles of internal cooldown, elemental gauge, decay rates, and ways to use this knowledge practically. Everything we're going to cover today is going to include gameplay footage, as well as useful graphs or tables when necessary in order to make it as easy to understand as possible. With that said, let's get right into it. Level 1, New Player. If you've already been playing Genshin for a while and have a basic understanding of elements, I suggest you skip ahead to the Aura vs Trigger section. There are currently 7 elements in the game. Players can currently play as Hydro, Pyro, Electro, Cryo, Anemo, or Geo characters, but we don't have any Dendro units. When using certain talents or attacks from these characters, you can apply their respective elements to enemies or trigger elemental reactions. While building your teams, you can benefit from a bonus called Elemental Resonance if you use certain elements. Using 2 Anemo units will give you the Impetuous Winds buff, decreasing stamina consumption by 15%, increasing movement speed by 10%, and shortening skill cooldown by 5%. This resonance isn't particularly strong in combat, but it can be very nice to use while exploring. Using 2 Hydro units will give you the Soothing Water buff, increasing incoming healing by 30%. It'll also be affected by Pyro for 40% less time when hit by attacks that apply Pyro to you. This buff is generally considered to be one of the weakest ones, as most healers already have enough healing to keep you alive. Using 2 Pyro units will give you the Fervent Flames bonus, increasing attack by 25%. You'll also be affected by Cryo for 40% less time. This buff is considered the most versatile, as 25% attack is useful in pretty much every comp, but it isn't all that significant. Using 2 Cryo units will give you the Shattering Ice buff, increasing your crit rate against enemies that are either frozen or affected by Cryo by 15%. You'll also be affected by Electro for 40% less time. This buff is very strong in teams where the condition is easily met, but it unfortunately doesn't work in many different teams. Using 2 Geo units increases your resistance to interruption. It also increases your damage by 15% when you're protected by a shield. This buff will generally increase your overall damage output by more than the Pyro buff would, but it has a condition, so it is situational. Using 2 Electro units will give you the High Voltage buff. This will let you be affected by Hydro for 40% less time. It will also make it so that Superconduct, Overloaded, and Electro-Charged reactions generate an electroparticles that gives you energy. This resonance can be very useful in teams that have problems with energy generation. Finally, using 4 units of different elements increases your resistance to all types of damage by 15%. Since this is a defensive buff, it isn't particularly useful, since most of the difficult content in this game is made difficult by timers and not strong enemies. At first glance, the elemental resonance buffs might make you think that you want to use multiple units of the same elements. While that can sometimes be true, you still definitely want to use units of different elements, as this gives you access to elemental reactions. And elemental reactions will occur when you apply 2 different elements to an enemy. Here are the different element combinations that trigger these reactions. Hydro plus Electro triggers Electro-Charged, which creates a damage over time effect that can spread to nearby wet enemies. Hydro plus Cryo triggers Frozen, which stops enemies from moving. Attacking those enemies with a Claymore or Geo attack will Shatter, dealing physical damage. Hydro plus Pyro triggers Vaporize, which amplifies the damage of the attack that triggers it. Cryo plus Pyro triggers Melt, which also has the same effect of amplifying the damage of the attack that triggers it. Cryo plus Electro triggers Superconduct, which deals a small amount of damage and reduces enemies' physical resistance. Pyro plus Electro triggers Overload, which deals damage and knocks foes away. Cryo or Hydro or Pyro or Electro plus Anemo, so any of those 4 elements plus Anemo, triggers Swirl, which spreads the initial element to nearby enemies. Once you unlock the Viridescent Venerer artifact set, this will also reduce those enemies' elemental resistance. Similarly, any of those 4 elements plus Geo triggers Crystallize, which doesn't deal any damage but creates a shard that you can pick up to gain a shield. You might notice that there is no reaction between Geo and Anemo. In order to understand why that is, we must first talk about the difference between an aura element and a trigger element. A trigger element, as its name suggests, is the element that triggers the elemental reaction. That means that the aura element is the element that is initially applied to enemies. Elemental auras generally don't do anything by themselves, except for the cryo aura, which slows enemies down. The reason why there is no Geo plus Animo reaction is because neither Geo nor Animo can be aura elements, as using Geo or Animo abilities on enemies that are not affected by any elements doesn't leave an aura for elemental reactions. Aura versus trigger also matters in determining the damage dealt by elemental reactions. The damage that your elemental reactions is going to do is always going to scale with the trigger character's stats and not the aura characters. Let's demonstrate this by using a low-level Lisa and a high-level Kea. When your trigger character is Kea, the damage is much higher than when the trigger character is Lisa. Level 2, Casual Player. You now know what each of the elemental reactions do. However, we haven't yet talked about how their numbers compare, their uses, their strengths, and their weaknesses. Let's start with the main difference between the two types of reactions. Multiplicative reactions, also called amplifying reactions, are very simple. All they do is multiply the damage of the attack that triggers them. There are currently only two multiplicative reactions, Melt and Vaporize. Both of these reactions have different multipliers depending on the element that triggers them. Triggering Melt with a Pyro ability will multiply its damage by 2, while triggering it with a Cryo ability will multiply its damage by 1.5. Similarly, triggering Vaporize with Hydro also multiplies its damage by 2, while triggering it with Pyro multiplies its damage by 1.5. The multiplicative reactions are generally considered stronger late-game options, as since they multiply the damage of the attack that triggers them, they don't only scale with Elemental Mastery, but they also scale with attack, crit stats, and damage percent stats. The biggest weakness of multiplicative reactions is how hard it can be to set them up properly because of some interactions we'll be talking about in the theory crafting section of this video. Their biggest strength, on the other hand, is the overall damage multiplier they bring to a team, as is the case in the Bennett plus Xiangling duo, the Diluc plus Xingqiu duo, or the Xiangling plus Ganyu duo. And again, we'll be going into more details on each of these examples in the last section of the video. Transformative reactions, on the other hand, deal damage based on your character's level and elemental mastery only. This means their damage will not change depending on the attack you use to trigger them, simply on the character you use. For example, if you were to trigger Superconduct with Kea and Lisa, you would get different numbers when you're using Kea as a trigger as you would using Lisa as a trigger. But you would get the same number using Lisa's normal attack versus using Lisa's skill. Because of this, transformative reactions are generally considered weaker damage alternatives in the late game. The transformative reactions I personally consider to be the weakest also happens to be the one that has the highest base damage, Overloaded. The reason I consider it to be the weakest is the amount of knockback it provides. Generally, you'll be able to deal with enemies more quickly if they're grouped together, as your AoE attacks will hit multiple enemies at the same time. However, Overloaded pushes enemies away, therefore having the opposite effect to what you want. The higher reaction damage generally doesn't make up for the loss of DPS from knocking enemies away from you and from each other, except in the early mid-game, where it represents a significant portion of your damage. The only real late-game uses to Overloaded are knocking enemies away from a monolith, but this is usually done better by Animo units, and destroying Geo shields, but that is also a really slow way to go about it, and you'd be better off using a Geo unit or a Claymore if your team comp allows it. Next up, we have Electro-Charged. Electro-Charge actually works in a different way from the other reactions, as you can have both a Hydro and an Electro Aura active on a character at the same time. This means you can use one ability to trigger two reactions on an Electro-Charged enemy. For example, you can use a Pyro ability on an Electro-Charged target to trigger Vaporize and Overloaded. The specifics of the inner workings of the Electro-Charge mechanic are quite a bit more complicated than the other reactions, so we'll be covering them in a later video. Electro-Charge isn't an insanely strong reaction, but unlike Overloaded, it doesn't have any actual downside, so while you don't want to build your comp around it, it can be a nice thing to have. Let's now move on to my personal favorite elemental reaction, Frozen. Frozen immobilizes your opponent for a short duration and will not deal any damage. However, any Claymore or Geo attack on a frozen target will cause Shatter, dealing physical damage based on the stance of the character who triggers Shatter, not the character who triggers Frozen. While an enemy is frozen, they are considered to be affected by a Cryo Aura for reaction purposes. This means you can trigger Melt with a Pyro ability or Superconduct with an Electro ability. However, the biggest strength of the frozen reaction lies in not triggering Shatter and keeping enemies frozen. This will have two main benefits. Firstly, keeping certain enemies frozen prevents them from generating or using their shields, such as the Fat Fatuis and the Shield Minotaurs. It'll also keep certain other enemies, such as the Eye of the Storm or Titan Mages, from running away from you. Secondly, keeping enemies frozen gives you access to the strongest situational artifact set in the game, Blizzard Strayer. The 4-piece set gives you 40% crit rate against frozen enemies, which is an insane amount of stats if you can manage to keep enemies in this state. Unfortunately, the Blizzard Strayer set is relatively weak on Cryo Claymore units such as Xiangling, since their attacks are going to Shatter, making you lose out on the effect on basically half of the attacks. Unfortunately, just like other transformative reactions, the damage you get from Shatter is not high enough to justify running Shatter comps over permafreeze comps. Next up, let's talk about Superconduct. Superconduct, unlike the other reactions we've seen so far, deals basically insignificant damage. However, it makes up for that lack of damage with a very useful effect. It reduces the enemy's physical resistance by 40%. You should note that resistance reduction is only half as effective once the enemy's resistance is below 0. So, using Superconduct on an enemy with 10% resistance would bring them to minus 15%, not to minus 30%, since the first 10% will be fully applied, and then the remaining 30% will be halved. Superconduct is used mainly for physical carries such as Razor, Xiangling with Crescent Pie, or sometimes Keqing. Since the debuff lasts for a decently long amount of time, you don't need to trigger it very often, letting you get away with high cooldown supports. Technically, Superconduct can have some sort of resonance effect where it deals more damage if enemies are clustered together, but this isn't practical as the damage increase is only significant when multiple enemies are clustered together, and that's generally quite hard to pull off, with honestly a really low payoff. Swirl's damage, much like Superconduct, is quite low. It can be used to spread elements, but once you reach Adventure Rank 25, you unlock the domain that can reward you with the Viridescent Venerer artifact set, which makes Swirl a vital element to multiple late-game teams. The 4-piece set bonus decreases an opponent's elemental resistance to the element infused in the Swirl triggered by a unit that holds this set by 40%. This resistance reduction works just like the resistance reduction from Superconduct. That, paired with the fact that the base damage is quite low, makes Swirl basically the elemental equivalent to Superconduct. Crystallize is the only elemental reaction that does not deal any damage. It drops a shard of the element you crystallized, and the shield it generates is much more effective against that element. Unfortunately, crystallized shields are honestly quite a bit weaker than shields generated by some units' talents. And on top of that, since Geo characters don't deal more damage based on their elemental mastery, making your crystallized shield stronger costs you the opportunity of dealing more damage, which is generally not a worthwhile trade-off. Because of this, Crystallize's main usage is generating shields for units wearing the 4-piece Retracing Bolide set, or making use of effects that do something when elemental reactions are triggered, such as Fischl's Ascension 4 passive. It can also be used in conjunction with the 4-piece Archaic Petra set to buff your party's elemental damage, although you have to make sure you pick up the crystal with the unit wearing the 4-piece Archaic Petra set in order to get that damage bonus. Level 3, Theory Crafter. Now, since I expect a lot of you probably skipped right to this part, this is probably the best moment to ask you to please leave a like on the video, since a lot of what I'll talk about from here on out isn't really well known outside of niche theory crafting Discord servers. Well, in reality, it's not too hard to grasp with a good explanation, and a lot of people could benefit from knowing this. On top of that, the Genshin fandom wiki page on these subjects is honestly completely terrible and doesn't explain them well at all. we'll mainly be talking about two concepts, internal cooldown and elemental gauge. Internal cooldown, the most simple of the two concepts, is about the principle that certain talents don't always apply their own element. As the name suggests, they have a cooldown for their elemental application that isn't shown in-game. This can make it harder to trigger elemental reactions in quick succession. Internal cooldown is unique to every talent, which means you can trigger two reactions almost immediately if they do not share an internal cooldown, but you cannot cause reactions in quick succession if the trigger talent has an internal cooldown. I've found that the best way to visualize internal cooldown is to test it against the Animo Hypostasis, as no matter how many reactions you trigger, it will not lose its innate element. You can then look for the time between every Swirl reaction, and that'll give you a rough estimate of the internal cooldown. However, do note that this is not always an accurate representation, as triggering multiple reactions in a row will not always show the reaction text even if the reactions do happen, as is the case when you use Xiangling's burst. As you can see, different units often have different internal cooldowns on their talents, making it very hard to correctly assess the strength of a unit without doing testing on them. A very good example of this would be comparing Keia's burst to Xiangling's burst. While Keia's icicles hit enemies much faster than Xiangling's Pyronado, it also applies cryo at a much slower rate, as Xiangling's Pyronado has an internal cooldown so low that every hit will apply pyro. This means that when using Xiangling's burst after using Keia's, the first few hits from Xiangling's burst will melt, but since the pyro element is being applied faster than the cryo element, it will soon start to be Keia's burst that triggers the melts. Unfortunately, since the cryo application does have an internal cooldown, only some of the icicles will melt, not all of them, leading to an overall poor use of elemental reactions that only ends up being a small damage boost. Before we can talk about the ways we can use our knowledge of internal cooldown to get damage boosts bigger than the ones we get from the Xiangling plus Keia combo, we have to talk about the second concept in this section. Elemental gauge is something that seems a bit scary to approach at first, but practically, it can be simplified as basically just glorified addition and subtraction. Every talent that applies an element to enemies also applies a certain amount of gauge units. This can be either 1, 2, or 4. As far as I'm aware, the only way to apply 4 gauge units as an aura is currently Beto's burst's initial hit. The higher the amount of gauge units, the longer the aura stays on an enemy. A 1 gauge unit skill, which we'll be calling 1U or 1 unit, will apply an aura for 9.5 seconds. A 2U skill will apply an aura for 12 seconds, and a 4U skill will apply an aura for 16.8 seconds. The best way to figure out the gauge strength of a talent is to simply time the duration of an aura, but if, like me, you're too lazy for that, I'll be leaving a link in the description to a spreadsheet made by Iron Fox on the Kaching Main's Discord server on every character and their respective talent's gauge strength. Now, let's go over some of the applications of Elemental Gauge, starting with practical applications with the characters we have available to us right now, and then talking about some cool, neat interactions that might work with units in the future. The most simple application of Gauge is present in Overloaded and Superconduct, and this is where the subtraction comes in. Quite simply, if you use a 2U aura and then a 1U trigger, the initial aura will stay on the enemy. Any other combination of 1U and 2U will remove the aura, as you subtract the amount of units on the trigger from the amount of units on the aura. Basically, if your aura has less units than the trigger, there's gonna be some gauge left on the enemies, so the element will not be removed. Unfortunately, since we only have a 1-4U aura and it's on a burst, it's not really practical to do any combos with it. There's one thing you have to keep in mind when you're trying to trigger multiple reactions without reapplying the aura, and that is that the elemental gauge's strength goes down over time. That means that if you wait long enough after applying a 2U aura, a 1U trigger will remove it. Technically, the decay rate isn't exactly linear, but we can use an approximation here since it's almost linear and it generally won't make much of a difference. Unfortunately, as I mentioned in the casual section for transformative reactions, Overloaded and Superconduct generally don't really offer great late game scaling, making the practical uses of gauge knowledge in these reactions honestly mostly irrelevant. However, that is not the case for multiplicative reactions, and here is where the practical uses of gauge knowledge come in. Much like transformative reactions, triggering multiplicative reactions removes a certain quantity of gauge from an enemy. However, unlike transformative reactions, a 1U trigger does not remove 1 unit of gauge. A 1U trigger will either remove half a unit or 2 units. Now why is that? Well, basically, just like Melt and Vaporize have different damage multipliers depending on the element that triggers them, they also have different gauge multipliers. This means triggering the weak side of a Melt or Vaporize reaction, whether it be Melt with Cryo or Vaporize with Pyro, will divide the amount of gauge units removed by that reaction by 2, while triggering the strong side of such a reaction, whether it be Melt with Pyro or Vaporize with Hydro, will multiply the amount of gauge units removed by 2. This means, using a 2U Cryo Aura, you can only trigger 1 Melt reactions no matter what trigger you use, because a 1U Pyro Aura will remove both of the Cryo units. And the same can be said about 2U Pyro Auras and Hydro triggers. However, when using Pyro Auras for Melt, or Hydro Auras for Vaporize, you can easily trigger multiple reactions. In those cases, if the aura is 2U, you can trigger 2 reactions with 2U triggers, or even up to 4 reactions with 1U triggers. A good application of this is Chongyun's Burst's triple or quadruple melt combo. The quadruple melt is unfortunately only possible at Constellation 6, as Chongyun's Burst only hits 3 times before that. On top of that, the quadruple melt is very hard to pull off since Chongyun's Burst has a relatively long animation, making it so that the Pyro Aura will generally have lost at least half a unit by the time the 3rd melt triggers, making the 4th hit generally not melt. It's possible to circumvent this weakness by using an off-field 2U Pyro Aura, but the only one we currently have is Amber's Baron Bunny, and since using Amber is kind of a sin, I can't really recommend it. And I'd rather recommend sticking to Bennett as your setup for triple melt. This works because Bennett's Burst and his kills are both 2U, meaning either can easily sustain the first 2 1U triggers of Chongyun's Burst, as they're multiplied by 0.5, leaving a Pyro Aura for the 3rd trigger to melt, leading to a triple melt. One thing to keep in mind, while the melt does trigger and the damage is multiplied, the text will only show melt once, because the text doesn't always show up when you trigger multiple reactions in a row. Now if you're using a 1U aura, a 2U trigger will remove it, however, it will be possible to trigger 2 reactions with a 1U trigger. Both of the units with the highest DPS ceilings in the game, being Ganyu and Diluc, can actually use this mechanic to significantly increase their damage. Every single one of their talents apply a 1U gauge. This means that as long as you have a way to constantly apply 1U or 2U auras, you'll be able to vaporize in Diluc's case, or melt in Ganyu's case, most of their damage. Let's now take a look at a few combs that use elemental gauge mechanics quite well. With Diluc, this is usually done by using Xingqiu. Xingqiu's elemental burst will reapply a Hydro every time you use a normal attack with Diluc. This means you'll be able to keep a Hydro aura on the enemy as long as you weave in a normal attack between each of your elemental skills. Because Diluc's normal attack has an internal cooldown on Pyro application, some of his normal attacks will not vaporize, but most still will, and every single one of his uses of his elemental skill will also vaporize. This is going to significantly increase the damage you do, and is the main reason why Diluc is considered to be one of the strongest carries in the game. Without this interaction, his damage is much closer to other strong carries like Keqing and Razor, but with it, he just skyrockets above the rest. Now with Ganyu, this is done by using Xiangling. Since both her Frostbloom arrow and her explosion are 1U, you can melt both with Xiangling's 1U burst or skill. Just use Xiangling's burst and then switch to Ganyu and basically everything will melt. This is the highest theoretical DPS out of all the carries we currently have, but is not always better than other alternatives because of how hard it can be to properly play and set up. Because of the gauge interactions with weak side, melt, and vaporize, while they are weaker than strong side for single instances of damage and impressive crits on Abyss 7, most theory crafters consider them to be stronger than strong side for consistent team DPS. However, that does not mean you should step away from using Pyro support with Hydro carries or Cryo support with Pyro carries. What it does mean is that when doing this, you should keep in mind that those units, those support units, are going to be the one triggering the reactions, so they won't enable your carry to do more damage, they will be enabled by your carry and deal a lot more damage because of that. The team comp that makes the best use of this mechanic is a Childe team comp, where Childe is the on-field carry while Xiangling is the enabled support. Since Childe's normal attack and Riptide Slash have separate and relatively short internal cooldowns, it's unrealistic to use a Pyro unit to vaporize Childe's DPS. However, you can use Childe to vaporize Xiangling's burst damage. Since Xiangling's burst has an internal cooldown low enough to trigger a reaction on every hit, by using her burst and then switching to Childe, you'll be able to vaporize every single instance of damage it deals, for a significant damage upgrade if you've invested into your Xiangling. A good late game combo for this comp would be done by using Albedo and Bennett. You set up your buffs with Albedo and Bennett, then use Xiangling's burst, then you switch to Childe, use your burst, and then switch to melee form and start bashing on enemies. This is going to vaporize Childe's initial burst, and is going to vaporize most of Xiangling's burst. Overall, this is a great way to make use of the knowledge we have of Elemental Gauge to increase your team's overall damage output by exactly 1 metric fuckton. In this specific combo, you're using a strong side Vaporize reaction on your one single big hit, and a weak side reaction on most of your DPS for the maximum amount of damage increase. There is currently only one real exception that I know of that actually makes use of strong side reactions for consistent DPS in the late game, and that is the Bennett comp. Since when you use Bennett as a DPS, most of his damage comes from his burst and his skill, you want to build pyro damage on him. However, since his normal attacks don't apply pyro, your application of pyro will be quite slow. This enables the use of a cryo support, since your pyro application will never happen fast enough for your cryo application not to be able to keep up. In order to make good use of this, you need a cryo support that has near 100% uptime on his cryo application, so the best option is definitely Chongyun. Ganyu can also work, but you'll have some downtime, so I don't really recommend it. Klee, unlike Diluc, has a lot of different sources of pyro applications and some 2U talents. This means it's much harder to consistently vaporize everything that she does. Because of this, while Xiao is definitely still an amazing option, he isn't head and shoulders above the rest, as is the case in Diluc comps. Since Mona's Hydro application is quite slow, she's not as strong as Xiao in Diluc comps, but Xiao doesn't have that edge in Klee comps, making Mona an amazing option in her comps. The last comp I want to talk about for multiplicative reactions is a comp that doesn't have a main DPS in the traditional sense. The on-field unit, Bennett, isn't really dealing much damage in this comp, and is best to run with either 4-piece Noblesse or 4-piece Instructor. The comp relies on Xiangling and Xiao working very similarly to the Childe comp I mentioned earlier. However, this comp allows you to generate a lot more pyro particles, more or less eliminating the need for energy recharge on Xiangling and letting you build her with only damage in mind. The reason why this works is you can use your skill on Bennett and then switch to Xiangling to catch the particles, and then you can do this over and over again until your bursts are back up. There are many options for a 4th unit in this comp. You can use Albedo for the elemental mastery he provides, post-buff Zhongli to shred resistances, and Anemo support for the same reason, Kea or Ganyu to convert some of the vaporizes to melts, although this variation can be harder to play properly, or Ningguang for the Petra bonus and the Thrilling Tales. Xiangling's burst deals damage based on her stats at the moment of casting, meaning even if Bennett's attack buff expires, Xiangling is still going to benefit from it. This also applies to the Instructor and Noblesse bonuses, the Thrilling Tales bonus, and Albedo's bonus Elemental Mastery. This comp isn't very strong in the current floor 12 because it has no real way to deal with the shields of the meta-trails, but it has a very high damage potential, so it definitely might be worth considering either for other floors or for future Abyss 12s. And that's about it for multiplicative reactions. You might notice there are still reactions we haven't talked about. We'll be ignoring the Frozen reaction, since its purpose is to be the only reaction in a freeze comp where knowing more about Gauge doesn't really help you increase your damage. We'll also be ignoring Electro-Charged, as I'm planning on making a full video on this specific reaction in the future, since the way it works is honestly quite a bit more complicated than the others. We'll also be ignoring Burning, since we don't have a way to apply Dendro to enemies. This leaves us with Swirl and Crystallize. Swirl and Crystallize both work very similarly to the other transformative reactions. However, much like weak side multiplicative reactions, the amount of gauge units these reactions subtract is halved. This means a 1U Anemo or Geo talent will reduce gauge by only 0.5, and a 2U Anemo or Geo talent will reduce gauge by 1. One thing you should know is that in the gauge database I've included, this is already taken into account. Now, you might think that because transformative reactions aren't particularly strong and Crystallize doesn't really do any damage, this gauge knowledge isn't very useful for Anemo and Geo units. However, that isn't actually the case. Since both Swirl and Crystallize work like weak side reactions, That means it is much harder for them to remove an aura. This can actually be insanely useful when choosing artifact sets, as both the Geo and Animal artifact sets are tailored to support units. If you have an Animal or Geo DPS, you can consider using a 4-piece set of Thunder Soother or Lava Walker, which give you increased damage when the enemies are affected by Electro and Pyro respectively, as it'll be easier to keep those auras on the enemies. On top of that, there are some situations like with Fischl, where her Ascension 4 passive significantly improves her Electro application, as it applies Electro whenever you trigger an Electro-related reactions. Of course, it also has an internal cooldown, so it won't always reapply it, but it's still quite useful. This means when using Ningguang or Sucrose, you can actually keep your uptime on Thunder Soother with Fischl or Lava Walker with Xiangling close to 100%. This also means that those sets might just be one of the options for building upcoming Animal or Geo characters, for example Xiao. Now that's about it when it comes to the practical uses of Gauge. I won't be going into too much detail about the non-practical uses, but we'll still be looking at it just a little bit because they might become useful in the future. The most interesting one is definitely the Aura extension, which looks into more detail at the decay rate of Gauge units. Now you may have noticed that it's kind of weird that a 1U aura takes 9.5 seconds to decay, but a 2U aura doesn't actually take twice that. That is because a 1U, a 2U, and a 4U aura actually have different speeds at which they decay, or decay rates. If you use two different talents of the same elements, you can actually kind of cheat these timers, since only the decay rate of the first application stays, while the amount of units is that of the second aura. For example, if you use a 1U followed by a 4U aura, such as Lisa's normal attack followed by Beto's burst, you'll be able to make the aura last about 38 seconds, which is 4 units decaying at 9.5 seconds each. Now, the reason why this isn't really practical is because the only 4U aura we can apply at the moment is Electro, so it doesn't really have any good practical late game uses. If we ever get a Cryo, a Hydro, or a Pyro 4U aura, now that might just change things. You can also use a 1U followed by a 2U aura to give you a little bit more time to trigger your reactions, as the total time will go from 12 seconds to 18 seconds. However, the increase isn't generally big enough to justify actually using it. Alright, that should be it. I took quite a while to work on this video because I didn't find any video covering this information in detail. I currently don't have enough subscribers to be monetized, but I don't plan on turning on monetization when I do, and I only upload videos when there's something I really want to talk about and I can't find the appropriate resources on YouTube. So I won't have an upload schedule consistent enough to actually make significant money off YouTube anyways. This should keep my videos ad-free and at least always somewhat interesting, so feel free to subscribe if this is the kind of content you want to see. If you think this information would be useful to other people, make sure to leave a like, comment telling me how your day was, and share the video just to boost it in the algorithm. And if you want to support me, ask me questions, or overall just see more of me, feel free to drop by my Twitch at twitch.tv/jeff77. Thank you for watching, and as always, farewell beautiful people.